Caribbean American legislators expressing outrage over faulty U.S. mail-in ballots sent to over 100,000 voters in Brooklyn. A court victory for Caribbean immigrants. A U.S. federal court has ordered the Trump administration to abandon last-minute changes to the 2020 census schedule. A Marshall Recovery Plan. Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness calls for a global economic plan to address the devastation from the pandemic. The latest developments in the Breonna Taylor case, a judge ordering the release of audio recordings of the grand jury hearing. We're going to talk about what it means for the case going forward. Saudi Arabia is seeking Guyana's support for the position of Director General of the World Trade Organization. And WestJet returning to the Caribbean. We'll have details on new flights to Jamaica and Mexico.
This is the Caribbean Times News with Alisha Davis.
I'm Alisha Davis in New York. Thanks for being with us. And we begin with our headline story, outrage over faulty absentee ballots. Over 100,000 absentee ballots with incorrect names and addresses printed on the return envelope were sent to Caribbean and other voters in Brooklyn. The error causing outrage amongst Caribbean American legislators. New York State Assembly member Rodneyce Bichot, also the chair of the Brooklyn Democratic Party, whose parents hail from Haiti, and New York City public advocate Jumaane Williams. He's the son of Grenadian immigrants. They both said that they were deeply troubled by the mistake. The New York City Board of Elections blamed the vendor responsible for printing and mailing the ballots, saying that they will be reprinted and mailed again with the label second ballot. Those faulty first ballots will not be counted in the vote. And a court victory for Caribbean immigrants. A U.S. court has ordered the Trump administration to abandon its last-minute changes to the 2020 census and to extend the time for counting for an additional month. Now, the preliminary injunction requires the Census Bureau to keep trying to tally the country's residents through October 31st. At stake is the political power and billions of federal dollars for schools, hospitals, public transportation, and more for the next decade. Now, earlier today, we spoke with Simone Archer from the Caribbean Attorney Network about this important decision.
Thank you for having me.
Now, please tell us, why is this ruling so important for Caribbean immigrants?
This ruling is very important because the census, it gets a count of the population. By getting a count of the population, there is $1.5 trillion in federal funding that's distributed to the states. So if the Caribbean community is undercounted, when they're going to the government for different type of state program and the government doesn't have it, it's because of that. So let's say, for example, it's counted that we only have 10 members in the state, but we have 30 members total. So 20 members are being undercounted. So when 30 people are going to the state for funding, the funds are not available. Yet still the funds may be available for other states with less population.
And now, why is the Trump administration trying to limit the time for tallying this census? And basically, how does it benefit his agenda?
Well, it benefits his agenda because, yes, there's the $1.5 trillion funding at stake for each state, but also the population count, there is 435 members for the House of Representatives. And though that number is allocated to the different state by the state population. So if you have a red state that's being counted accurately, they'll have more representative in the House than a blue state who's being counted. And the Caribbean community is most likely in those blue states. But even if you're in the red states, you need to be counted so that the number of representative that's in the government, it's accurately for your state.
Right. And now I know you have an event, for example, coming up that serves the community in Brooklyn. Tell us about that and why things like that need to make sure they get funding.
Right. This event that's coming up is coming up on October 7th, and it's actually for the entire state. It's for the entire city. New York City Commissioner for Small Business Services, the city obtains funding from the federal government. With those funding, the city is able to implement different programs. So the commissioner for the small business services they have a lot of program that's beneficial to small business owners. We have a lot of Caribbean members who own small businesses and is not aware that resources are available for them to assist their business, especially in these times where businesses are losing profits. They may have issues with their lease agreement. The city has a program that can assist them with that.
Especially important, as you said, in a time like this with COVID. And now, if Trump gets reelected, do you think that we're going to see similar cases like this one or gerrymandering that can suppress the political power of the Caribbean immigrant community in the U.S.?
Oh, definitely. And one thing about the census is the decision for this census lasts a decade. That's 10 years. So it doesn't matter who's in office next, it'll be effective for 10 years. So, we need to get accounted so that all the resources for the next 10 years can be distributed how it's supposed to, so that the House of Representatives have the required number that should be allocated for the state, and that goes into the electoral college and everything like this. So not having an accurate count for this census is very detrimental for the next decade.
Exactly. Simone, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now to calls for a global recovery plan to address the devastation caused by the pandemic. In an address to the United Nations high-level event on financing for development in the era of COVID and beyond, Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness spoke of the severe economic fallout for countries like Jamaica that rely heavily on tourism. He called for a global recovery plan that is as innovative, ambitious, and impactful as the Marshall Plan. Now, you might recall the Marshall Plan was a U.S.-sponsored program designed to help European countries following World War II. Here's a bit of what Prime Minister Holness had to say.
The reality for developing countries is one of overburdened health systems, weak infrastructure, and inadequate fiscal resources to respond effectively to the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. Caribbean islands, with heavy dependence on service industries, particularly tourism, have been among the most severely impacted. The poor, the vulnerable, and our women have been primary victims. The scope of this pervasive pandemic clearly demands an extraordinary, inclusive, and sustainable global management of the recovery process. The world needs a global plan as innovative, ambitious, and impactful as the Marshall Plan was to Europe's recovery after the devastation of World War II. We must seize the opportunity this time around to make the global recovery plan sustainable.
Coming up after the break, our legal analyst Eon Smith helps us make sense of the latest in the Breonna Taylor case. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Since the coronavirus, global travel seems risky, but with Promo Caribbean, you don't have to worry. Our COVID-19 alerts feature, coupled with our comprehensive travel guide featuring over 20 countries, contains all you need to keep updated and safe during the pandemic. Whether it's Belize, Barbados, Haiti, or Guyana, our travel guide has all you need from safe places to eat, transport options, pharmacies, embassies, hotels, and Airbnbs. Not feeling well? You could take the COVID self-assessment test on our app. If you happen to be in the Caribbean or are looking to travel during these uncertain times, then Promo Caribbean is going to be your best friend. Today more than ever, you need to stay informed and stay safe. With Promo Caribbean, you don't have to worry. We've got you. Download the app from the App Store or Play Store now.
For the latest in Caribbean culture, news, sports, and entertainment, tune in to CaribVision. We keep you up to date on developments in your region. CaribVision. We broadcast across the Caribbean, in the New York tri-state area, Canada, and Europe. CaribVision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Welcome back to Caribbean Times News and new developments in the Breonna Taylor case. As protesters gather around the U.S. to express their dissatisfaction with the grand jury's decision, new evidence could be coming to light. Now, earlier today, we spoke to attorney and rule of law advisor Ian Smith to help us make sense of the latest in the case. Now, the judge has now ordered the release of the audio recordings of the grand jury hearing. It's thanks to an anonymous member of that grand jury. You're a former prosecutor. Take us through what happened here.
Well, basically, because of all of the protests and all of the issues that are being raised throughout the country, there's pressure, right? There's pressure on the judge, there's pressure on the prosecutor to sort of shed some light on this situation because we're getting conflicting evidence. So the judge decided that he's going to grant the request to release the information. The attorney general decided that he's going to request that the judge give them more time, which is reasonable in light of the fact that they're saying they want to redact personal information of witnesses. That's a normal process. However, we are still waiting to see exactly what evidence was presented to the grand jury. There are some concerns regarding what they actually was able to use to make a determination about the outcome of the shooting that took place that involved the death of Breonna Taylor. Ballistics evidence have contradicted some of the things that the Attorney General himself has said. We know now that based on the ballistic report, that you cannot say conclusively that one of the other officers were not responsible for the injury to the officer that was shot during the course of that night. That's very significant.
Very significant. And now that grand jury member is also asking to be able to speak out publicly because they say that what was presented to the grand jury isn't being publicly disclosed, correct?
Well, that's a very interesting because the grand jury member now, having been inside of the grand jury, would have heard all of the evidence that we obviously are trying to see and get into some insight into what was presented. That person probably is looking at what's being reported and what he or she was informed or told during the course of the presentation and realize that it's not the same, right? So that can be a very significant development because if the grand juror comes out and say, I didn't even know that there were witnesses to the Breonna Taylor incident that said that they did not hear that the police announced themselves. All we heard is one witness who said, yes, I heard them say police and they identified themselves. That's significant because that means that they did not get the full story to make their decision.
And now one of the officers says that he intends to file civil lawsuits against those who have called him a murderer for his role in this fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. Does he have a case here?
I don't believe that he has a case. This is a situation in which someone did die, and as a result of his action or the actions of his fellow police officers, right? They were there, shots were fired. Breonna Taylor died as a result of police shooting her. I don't believe they have a case in terms of saying people cannot label him as a murderer. At the end of the day, when someone kills another person, that's common parlance. Someone will say you murdered them. The evidence, we don't even know if the evidence is to the contrary, quite frankly, because we don't know what was presented to the grand jury. I don't think anyone really has to worry about a libel or standard claim against them.
Well, we know that the FBI is now involved in this case, and the family received that $12 million settlement from the state. But is that it? The family gets paid and the cops just walk free?
We're hoping that's not it, right? That's why the pressure is still on in terms of trying to get the grand jury minutes, or in this case, the grand jury recording, to see exactly what was presented to the grand jury. There's question as to why the attorney general might have misrepresented to members of the public that the ballistic from the evidence that was presented indicated that it could not have been fired from one of the officers, which we know now that there's no conclusive evidence that it was not fired from one of the officers, which means that it could have been one of the officers' bullets. There's a lot still to be discovered and to be unearthed in this particular case. I think we have a little ways to go, and we hope that everything comes out. The truth is what we're really seeking in this particular case.
Exactly, and we're going to find out a lot more when those audio recordings do come out. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And that was attorney and rule of law advisor Ian Smith. Coming up, WestJet is returning to the Caribbean. We'll have the details just ahead.
Mac Shack, New York, dedicated to providing a unique dining experience by offering classic, seasonal, and modern creative macaroni and cheese flavors. Find their locations at macshacknewyork.com. That's MACSHACKNY.com.
And welcome back to Caribbean Times News. Now, Saudi Arabia is seeking Guyana's support for the World Trade Organization's top post, the Director General of the WTO. A delegation headed by the Arab country's governor responsible for foreign trade met with Guyana's president, Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali. A statement issued after the meeting said that the Saudi Arabia delegation also included officials from Antigua and Barbuda. The process to select a new WTO Director General began back in July with Egypt, Kenya, Korea, Mexico, Moldova, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom also vying for the post. And WestJet is returning to the Caribbean. Beginning October 4th, WestJet will be relaunching flights from Toronto and Calgary to a host of Caribbean destinations, including Kingston, Montego Bay, and Cancun. And that does it for this edition of Caribbean Times News. To all of our friends across the Caribbean and all around the world, thank you for watching and good night.